Hey guys, this is Daniel.
And this is Jeremy.
All right. If you like this video, comment, share, subscribe, and we also have a link in the description below about to see who is going to win this debate. Please fill it out.
And please vote that we're both cucks.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. With that being said, let's get into it.
So today we're going to argue the death penalty.
All right. What's our resolution?
Our thesis, our resolution, whatever you want to call it, is the state should completely abolish the death penalty in all instances.
Okay. And I am for that resolution, so I am against the death penalty.
And I am against the resolution and very pro death penalty.
Okay. And we're going to take this kind of point by point because a lot of ours match up in the opposite direction, and then we'll go from there.
All right. So my first argument that I'd like to present is that the death penalty is a huge deterrent to violent crime.
Okay.
You want me to present more? Okay.
Well, I kind of need some statistics to back it up. I mean, I could say I have the biggest penis in all the land, but it's just not true.
All right. Well, there's a nuance to this argument because usually you'll hear that it's not. And on a country level, if you look at it without any analysis, you would be correct in thinking so. But that's just a little too simple. There's a big distinction going on. If you look at what states have the death penalty and what states don't have the death penalty, that's usually where you compare to see if there's a deterrent. And states without the death penalty usually have less violent crime. But there's something else going on here. The states without the death penalty tend to be much wealthier than the other states. But, for example, the states with the sixth highest median incomes, they are, let's see, Maryland, Hawaii, Alaska, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and the District of Columbia is in there too. Massachusetts is the sixth highest with median income. Those six all have no death penalty. The second highest, or the one right behind all those at number 7, is New Hampshire.
Okay, so from this, I gather the point you're saying is where the death penalty is, there is less violent crime. But would you say it is directly in proportion to...
No, I'm saying the opposite. Usually there is more violent crime where there is no death penalty, but I don't think it has to do with the death penalty. It has to do more with median income and poverty. The best way to draw this analysis out, because most of the analysis and statistics you'll find on the web is cluttered by the fact that we don't take into account what places have what levels of income disparity and who and what places have the most money. If you were to compare number 6 on the list, Massachusetts, which has no death penalty, and has more money than number 7, which is New Hampshire, you will find that New Hampshire has a higher rate of crime on the whole, but a much lower rate of violent crime, including murder.
I mean, that could also be argued that statistically New Hampshire is much smaller population-wise too, so it's not exactly the fairest of comparisons in that sense.
I'm talking about percentage.
Okay.
And, I mean, if you wanted to look at this discrepancy right here, property crime in New Hampshire, it's much higher than property crime in Massachusetts.
But we're not talking about property crime. We're talking about violent crime that you could be executed for.
Exactly, which gets reversed with violent crime. The only thing that you could be prosecuted for is violent crime when it comes to the death penalty. And violent crime is substantially lower in New Hampshire as opposed to Massachusetts.
You can be prosecuted for treason and other kind of things that are actually, you can be put to death for that aren't, I mean, yes, they could be violent, but you could have been a terrorist that was going to commit a certain crime, had those opportunities, and that's still part of it.
That's fair. Would you also say it's fair that violent crime is the vast majority of that, the things you could be put to death for?
Yes.
So, I mean, how else would you explain this discrepancy right here? These two states of similar size and percentage-wise, your chance of being a victim of violent crime, I don't have it on this cutout, but it's much higher in Massachusetts, which has no death penalty.
What? Looking at those, I would tend to look at some other states too. And so I think a lot of people who look at this from the aspect of having the death penalty in those states is actually helping those situations out violent crime-wise. If you look in Texas, though, where hundreds of people every single year are put to death, #1 state for that kind of thing too. Proportionally, percentagely, in other states that don't have the death penalty, like Maryland, who we haven't had it for about 17 years now, that it doesn't disproportionately affect that. Saying that the more death penalty that is in one place, or the people that are more likely to be executed, because you could have those states that still have it on the books, but those judges and juries don't tend to dish it out in the same severity. But in Texas, they do frequently, often, and it's just not in the same percentage as other states. So in that balance, I think a lot of people would argue that if you had that more, if you had more death penalty, was more likely to be convicted and sentenced for that, then that would help deter crime, but that doesn't seem to be statistically adding up.
Well, there is also more going on there. Like I said, with the whole income, Texas is a very large area, and there's lots of disparity in who owns what. A better way of even thinking about how poverty causes crime isn't that poverty by itself, but it's the presence of poverty with the presence of people who aren't in poverty. It's something called the Gini coefficient, which, if you look at it, is a very statistically useful concept when looking at crime rates. Mm-hmm. If you have an area where there is a group of people in poverty and a group of people who are not, the bigger that deviation between those two groups, the more likely the crime. And when you have a place like Texas that's as big and as wide income-wise, that's why I chose medium income and not gross GDP for my analysis. If you look at this list I have of...
Would you, spinning off of that, so if we're not talking necessarily median incomes or the total disparities and everything like that, isn't violent crime altogether across all 50 states in America on the decline and has been for a few decades now?
It might be.
Okay. So proportionally speaking with that, in accordance with the death penalty here, so I'm looking at a graphic right now. It's murder rates in the states with and without the death penalty. And on this graphic, we'll put it up on the screen. The one in red says murder rate in death penalty states and murder rate in non-death penalty states. And there's actually, you can see from here, these are FBI crime statistics per 100,000 in the U.S. That's steadily from about the early 90s to about 2010, I think, or 2009 when the study was finished, that there is kind of that gap there too. And I think it's actually really interesting to talk about because the points you brought up almost are completely counterintuitive to it.
I'm sorry, I'm misunderstanding your graph. Can you explain that again?
So, murder rate in death penalty states where people are convicted of murder. It's not that there's just more murders and those people haven't been, judged, convicted, sentenced to death penalty, maybe not sentenced to death penalty. That is lower than the ones with non-death penalty.
So you say the murder rate in death penalty states is lower than non-death penalty states?
No, I'm saying that the ones that do not have it.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying. The reason that exists is because the states without the death penalty have less of a Gini coefficient. There's less disparity there. Like you brought up Texas a second ago. On the rate of lowest Gini coefficient to highest, it is number 43 out of all the states. So it's 7th on the list of who has the highest Gini coefficient. There's the greatest disparity there if you look at this, number 43 right there. So, I mean, you would expect to see a much higher rate of murder in a place with a much higher Gini coefficient. It makes perfect sense. What doesn't make sense is to ignore all the facts about disparity and poverty when you look at these murder rates. If you take places like I said before, New Hampshire and Massachusetts that are very similar in these regards, similar location, size of place, and you can even see that New Hampshire has a larger crime rate for other crimes, but only lower for violent crimes. The only thing I could possibly draw out of that is that the death penalty was some kind of deterrent. I did not have time to do analysis on multiple states, but I figured 6th and 7th were the best.
I understand that, and I think a really important part of this debate is that since I'm on the negative side, I have to just I wouldn't say even cast a reasonable doubt, but I don't have to necessarily, I just show that it's not benefiting its society. It's not doing these things. It's not deterring. It's not moral. It's not cost effective even, which we'll get into later. And that I think your side of the case is actually a lot more difficult because you have to prove those things rather than me. I just have to negate them in a sense.
Yeah, I have the burden of proof.
Yeah.
But like I said, all the statistics that you've shown me with murder rate don't take into account for any kind of disparity, any kind of poverty, any other effects of murder. It's a very simply done thing. Most of these states that have the death penalty are poorer countries, less developed, or not poor states, less developed, and that's because of their poverty. Things even though there's a correlation there, there's not a direct causation. And in a situation where it's very similar, like Massachusetts and New Hampshire, we're more likely, the correlations there are more likely to be causation.
Okay. Well, even though I think that's kind of interesting. So when you had the slip up about other countries and stuff too, I wanted to bring those into the debate here too, because besides the states, I believe China, and Japan, I know still has it on the books, but it hasn't been used in about 70 or 80 years. And I think Russia, I'm not 100% sure. Basically, the only modern countries, like you said, that are currently have it by law enacted that they can be used in certain situations too. And another situation that I was made aware of was there was a study done about Hong Kong, which doesn't have the death penalty and hasn't, I think, since the 1994, and Singapore, which is mandatory for a lot more crimes than even in the States or in other countries like that, for that. And both of those populations, I mean, they're giant cities. So, like there's a lot of income disparity and stuff in between those things because of the populations of the people, a lot of poor people, also a lot of rich people. But the study that was done, I think it was for the
Do you have the statistics on the disparity for them?
I do. I found that the rates were approximately the same in those two cities, not necessarily taking into account those things you were talking about too, because I think that adds an interesting element to it. But two countries, kind of similar backgrounds and stuff too, but the death penalty didn't deter those people necessarily in those instances from committing those even more basic crimes, I think. Because if you could be sentenced to death for even just stealing a lot of stuff or something like that too, which you can't be in the United States, that would seem almost like it'd be a lot more overwhelming to somebody thinking about doing those things. But from what I've looked at, I can't necessarily come to that conclusion.
I'd say that would muddy the point as well. When it comes to something like stealing, it could be very possible that you need to steal whatever you're stealing to survive. So I think something like a violent crime where it's obviously not out of necessity is a much easier way to get to the heart of the issue. Mm-hmm. But I would have to look at all the statistics in full to really...
Yeah, of course.
Would you like to move?
So then from that point then, so you're saying you only would want the death penalty in those extreme cases then. You wouldn't argue it to however the state wants to get it across.
Yeah, I would argue a reformed death penalty. There's some other things I'll get into when we get into cost.
Sounds good. All right.
Which do you want to transition the cost now?
Yeah, sure. You can start off with that.
You should probably lead it because otherwise I'm gonna have to summarize your position first. Okay.
So, the main thing that comes into that people talk about for the death penalty, how it saves money, is that it cuts 20, 30 years off somebody's sentence, so they don't have to pay just sit and rot in a jail somewhere too, which is very interesting that that's the way it's kind of framed, almost like you're just you're getting rid of and then you can fill that slot with somebody else. That's the thing though, a lot of these situations, prisons are very for-profit kind of industries and stuff too, so they don't benefit from just having empty cells open. But the main thing that comes down to it is that the court costs are really kind of where it gets people. So in Maryland, from 1978 to 1999, $186 million were spent on these capital punishment cases. And then they did an analysis from those that did seek the death penalty and those that didn't, even for very similar crimes, that the cost per case was about $3 million for those with the death penalty, because they had to go to so many more hearings, that have so many more processes done. And then those that did not seek that outcome was about $1 million less. So you were saving $1 million per case over those years if those did not seek the death penalty, and even a couple $100 million in a simple state or county budget too can actually go a long way.
Yeah, that's something I came across in my research too. When I did break down the costs, like you said, most of it is trial fees and appeals. Mm-hmm. And a big problem we have with the death penalty, at least in America, is there's no limit to the amount of appeals you can make once you're on death row, and people can stay on death row pretty much indefinitely for years
exactly.
and
years.
If
they can drag it out long enough. Yep.
If I were to argue what death penalty should look like, I would say 1 trial, 2 appeals, and get it over with in at least a year's time. I think that would be the most cost-efficient way to do it. And like you said, our prisons and courts are for-profit, mm-hmm. and if we're going to do it right, we need to eliminate that.
I think expediting the process would actually jump the cost actually a lot higher, because you would have to fit all those other processes that you have to go through by law. It's not just this hearing, case dismissed kind of. There's, like you said, if you wanted to put a year's worth of appeals or something on like that, and then after the last appeal,
2 appeals.
2 appeals?
I would limit it severely. I think, 3 times is the charm, really. That's what I'd say. Trial,
Okay.
2 appeals, and I'd limit a lot of the other legislation around it.
Okay. Well, spinning off for that a little bit too, and that goes into another one of my points. So if we're going with a expedited form where you just kind of want to get in there, get it done, wash hands of it, case closed, I think.
Before you get into that, I have some more cost things to argue.
Okay, let's go.
Change that. So another thing with cost, like Daniel said before, life without parole currently seems to be cheaper when you look around than capital punishment. This is a very tricky thing to look into because everybody has a different number when it comes to life and parole. I believe, let me see, the Price of Prisoners organization says the price is $31,307 per year. But in some states like New York or Washington, they mention it's $50,000 to $60,000. Other places report that in California, the cost of having a prisoner is $75,560 a year.
Okay.
But these numbers aren't even completely honest. That's the main cost of having a prisoner. A huge problem we're running into nowadays is elderly prisoners. A lot of life without parole prisoners becoming old.
Healthcare, yeah.
In the state of Virginia, half of their annual budget for prisons is spent just on healthcare for the elderly prisoners. That's half of their entire budget for prisons. It's becoming a huge problem. These things are being ramped up. There's also these numbers that take averages into account don't take into account the appeals that capital punishment people, whatever you want to call them, do. And they have a lot of appeals and legal processes that cost money themselves. Most criminals cannot afford their own attorneys, and that is all covered by the state. These numbers are not completely honest.
So you would say then by having this cost-effective measure done, so you're taking out this portion, would you say that would be significantly helping the cost budget overall of the entire U.S. penitentiary system? Because currently there are only about 20 to 100 inmates on death row. So even with those higher figures that you showed, 75,000 plus a year, plus healthcare, whatever, you would be cutting less than really 0.5% or even 1% out of all the money that's being spent over the 2 million plus prisoners in the entire country.
Well, like I said, in Virginia, the medical care of the elderly prisoners alone is half their entire budget for the penitentiary system.
Yeah, but we're not talking about people that are just. I mean, for that, I think that's a lot more broader than just capital punishment crimes. I think that's what we need to narrow this down to, because we can't. We're not. I mean, we would obviously argue that there's a lot of ways that prison systems could cut costs and stuff, but I think we need to focus on the people who are actually in jail for those specific crimes.
The alternative to capital punishment is life without parole, and life without parole almost inevitably means that you will become an elderly inmate. I mean, unless you're murdered, which the rates are high for that, but there's a significantly high percentage of those patients who live to old age in the system, and their costs are exponential. And as our population ages, and as all the the non-death row inmates, as you would have them be, age, those prices will just rise again. I think that is an important thing to look at when you compare the cost of the two.
Okay, so you would argue over a almost like a short-term cost-effective reach versus restate that point one more time, because I think it makes sense, but I want to make sure I know what you're saying.
So I'm arguing that it might not be completely honest that life without parole is cheaper than the death penalty. I think even if you didn't take my ideas of the reform of how capital punishment is dealt, a lot of the numbers associated with life without parole and its cost are dishonest. And these numbers also, along with being a little dishonest and a little clouded, will change drastically as we have older and older inmates.
Okay.
So do you want to counter that, or do you want to move on to another?
I guess my counter to that would be that, yes, the statistics are a little bit muddied, and at this point, we both are on the different sides of this argument, this coin necessarily, and even there's not exactly good data to support either of us 100%. I think the point you made about the growing healthcare costs and too of elderly inmates actually is really interesting and probably hasn't been looked into enough and studied enough. And I also think that the points that we talked about with the court costs and such and other things like that also definitely play a role in this.
All right.
All right. Segueing from that into spinning off the point you were talking about expediting certain cases and stuff like that too, so you would help cut costs. I think that's a very, very dangerous route, because these appeals and hearings play a giant role in determining the end of somebody's life, that even with forensic science and other forms of evidence that we have today has been repeatedly overturned in the past about, I believe, 10 or 15 years or so. There's been found for a lot of cases regarding this that the notion that, forensic science, I was even watching a video and stuff about forensic biting science or something like that too, where
John Oliver.
Yeah, where there was a guy who was convicted of murdering somebody because of certain bite marks and stuff too, and later that guy who was the so-called expert in it renounced it 20 years later once these people were acquitted of it completely. And not just talking from that too, but even with DNA evidence, a lot of it can be tampered with, a lot of it can be misrepresented, especially in court. And I think that's actually more important. I think the science actually does have a lot of validity to it. It's just really misapplied because it's brought before judges and juries that are scientifically illiterate, and really all they're going there to hear is this expert on either side say, yes, because of my scientific background and my analysis, this person is guilty and thus should receive the death penalty, when in a lot of cases, like I said, it's very misapplied and very disingenuous.
So I'd like to say, one, I don't necessarily disagree with you on that, but I think mistrials are almost a completely separate issue. Even if you were to give me, I know there's statistics out there about people who are supposedly innocent after given the death penalty. Even if that is the case, these people this is years and years and years after they would have been innocent, and it is not a majority of death penalty people.
There is a good...
These people would be punished in another way, regardless. Usually life without parole, and a lot of them might have died in prison, especially if they were completely innocent. Surviving prison is a very hard thing to do.
Exactly, but in that sense, you're almost dooming the innocent to be convicted and liberating the guilty, because for every person that they convict wrongly, the person who actually did the crime goes free. So you're actually kind of... The death penalty there isn't really actually solving that problem.
They're going free regardless, though. I mean, let's
Not
say
if they were convicted correctly, and that even though, like what we said, the data or the science in that case is definitely confusing sometimes for sure for people to understand.
I'm kind of confused on what you're saying. I mean, if there's a mistrial, regardless of the punishment, then an innocent person would be punished, and the guilty person would not be punished. Right? I mean,
Okay.
even if you switched all death penalties to life without parole or a spanking.
Yeah, but I'm saying the finality in this case brings that point more to light, and I think it's something should be definitely noted. Because it's almost saying, like, if that person wasn't there or something like that too, that it leaves the door open for those. Like you said, maybe it's more of a mistrial in general kind of situation too. But I think the state wrongly convicting somebody because either they were trying to cut corners if we were going more the cost-effective route, or that this is just the moral or the just way to solve the problem, that we're really skipping out on a lot. And I think that's kind of the issue with the whole system in this situation. Does that make sense?
I'm a little confused.
Okay. So basically, to clarify, that the forensic science and the way it's applied in mistrials and scientifically illiterate judges and juries really clouds the issue. And I think that for that reason, it's a path that the death penalty, because of the way it is, because it's final, and you don't have that option of life and parole and stuff too, is very it's dangerous, honestly.
All right, what if it was something we didn't go along the corrupted kind of evidence as we have today? Let's say it was something as straightforward as a 4K HD video of a man raping a group of small children and murdering them. In that case, would you be okay with the death penalty? Is it just a certainty issue?
No, it's not just a certainty issue. I believe in that case, because for violent crimes and stuff too, that this is not a deterrent. Having death penalty in these states would not have necessarily stopped that crime from being committed, regardless of, like I said, if the guy was going to commit it or not. That you still solve the same exact problem. If he's dead or in jail, he still can't rape or hurt anybody else. And
that actually isn't always entirely true. Did you know 1 in 200 inmates in the U.S. system escape?
Really?
Yeah. So you could have a man who potentially goes and murders and rapes, let's say, 20 children, goes to prison, and maybe he's the lucky 1 in 200 that escapes and goes off doing it again.
What's this?
Because of that lack of finality you talked about earlier, there is always the chance that he can commit that crime again. It works both ways.
Then, I mean, the point for that too could be, it could be, I mean, the recidivism rates for these kind of issues are not necessarily up in the air, especially for the more violent crimes, because they don't tend to get parole, or they don't tend to ever actually get out. But I mean, that argument could go for any prisoner in there, regardless if it was these kind of crimes or if he was even just a petty crime. So in my case, that would be buff up the system, and that, yeah, that's kind of a more long-term thing, and that in the meantime, other crimes and stuff could happen. But take your best shot. I mean, don't give them parole. I feel like that, even though it's kind of necessarily cruel, because that person could hurt other people, they also couldn't. And arguing from a kind of like a gap in the future where you don't know is, I would say, kind of lacking in evidence.
I mean, I could say the same thing with buffing up the system, but in the regards of evidence. Exactly.
So it's different.
I think
it's difficult to prove something that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think we both say that the system is kind of fucked up and could use a lot of improvement. Yeah. But I think we would argue differently on what should be changed. Agreeing on some parts where it's like corrupt evidence. But let me move into something that you think Daniel would argue instead. I'm going to argue that it's moral to kill these people and immoral not to. And where I'm coming from this is, if we do not kill them and we say it is wrong to kill them, we're essentially putting them ahead of the victim in moral consideration. And the victim's families. Like I said before, 1 in 200 of these people escape. So it is very possible these people could escape and go after the victims, and you make the victims live in fear knowing that this person is still out there. I think it's contemptible.
Okay. I want to clarify, though, that statistic that you said, it wasn't 1 in 200 of these violent, necessarily, crimes and stuff, too. That
it's all inmates, but, I mean, if they're all in the same prison, it's very similar.
I would disagree with that, but okay. For that presupposition, I think we kind of... I'm going to turn the frame a little bit, and you would say you're not giving those families justice. You're kind of, like you said, you're putting the victim behind the person that actually committed the crime.
Yes.
Which, okay, in a better system, in a system that kept that person locked up and kept that person from not escaping, regardless of that too, I still see the outcome coming to the same situation, because there are a lot of aspects of this that when the families are brought into these courts trials, that even some of them are allowed to witness the executions and stuff too, that they thought they wanted the same thing that happened to their victim, their family, to their loved ones, and then they realize when witnessing it or actually having it, done, that they didn't want it, and a lot of them regret it.
Well, do you know what number that is? Because I'd imagine it's a small percentage, and I would argue that the exception really is not against the rule; it's almost proof of the rule.
So you would say that people, especially I guess in our society, tend to really want that kind of hatred and kind of like that brutality to the end of it.
I would call it justice, but yes.
So like with like.
Yeah, I think eye for an eye is something very core in our human values. I don't think you can really get away from that. I think that's what justice demands sometimes, especially in something as heinous as murder.
Okay. Well, I think on a lot of those aspects too, you're almost tainting that aspect of justice, because you're giving them exactly what they received in the end, and you're almost like, and I think the problem with it is too, is because we have these specific examples of people and families and situations like this too, but how generally that the society it's almost like a human sacrificing principle, where we follow these people on the news, we demonize them and stuff too, and even in some cases too, I read a statistic, 5 to 10% of the people on death row are mentally ill for committing these kind of crimes too. So I think that's an aspect we should talk about, and that the means of giving them exactly what they received in the end equivocates them actually with the killer. So I would say that the state, I wouldn't say killing people all across the board in every situation is wrong, self-defense in certain aspects and other things too. I don't grant the state the right to do that because of these other flaws and stuff with the system where it couldn't be 100% right, or you couldn't exactly know, or this isn't actually what justice looks like.
So you're just saying because the system is imperfect that you wouldn't allow?
I'd say you'd be making it worse and more imperfect and not deterring crime and not being cost effective and all these things because of it, yes.
Even controlling for the other problems?
I'm talking about in these aspects right now. I mean, and if you didn't have those perfect, if you had those perfect situations where you always knew exactly who committed the crime and you always could catch them and you could always make sure they didn't get away and cost less, I think that's this is not the situation in the world we're living in.
Well, as the resolution states at the very end, the state should completely abolish the death penalty in all instances, in all possible instances. And one instance would be a system that otherwise has its shit together. Wouldn't it be?
I mean, if you could read it that way, I guess I wouldn't read
That's
it that
how
way.
I was thinking about it.
Okay, fair enough. Well, even though, and I said the state still doesn't have the right. I didn't say individually or on certain aspects that people just can't kill. I wouldn't argue for a complete pacifist government or something in that sense.
Well, no, that's not exactly the same point. But there's like a difference between like when you're fighting a war and you kill someone, you could argue that's more akin to self-defense than having someone on trial and killing them.
Yeah, because at that point they're already going to probably lose.
Probably. I'd like to make it certain.
Yeah.
So we've made our moral arguments. We've done that. I wanted to argue that it reduces vigilante justice, but I never got into looking up statistics for that. I saw a video of a dude who killed his son's molester, and I thought that would be a good, interesting thing to explore.
I'd honestly, I mean, that gets kind of into like the Purge-esque kind of territory, where...
Well, that's different, because the Purge could be like, I just don't like Sally because
exactly.
Sally's just such a bitch to me at lunch.
If you give those, if the state, says for these certain crimes that we can answer them with death, then I think it's almost like a big government versus small government issue too, because when you give the state that power and then they can expand on it or contract on it, basically, because it's not like, there's a senators and stuff for those who are enacting this kind of legislation stuff that you can call up and say, hey, I want this to happen. Hey, I don't want this to happen. Like, these are rules and situations that we as individual citizens really don't have any say over.
So you're arguing it could be like a slippery slope to something else?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, the slippery slope is a fallacy for a reason.
I said it could be. I didn't say it would be.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like, oh, gay people get married. What's next? We're gonna fuck horses. It's the same.
I think that's a very non-akin situation, because
I mean, what you're saying is, if we let the state kill people because they're murderers, we expand it to the state killing people because they jaywalked, right?
Not necessarily, but I leave the option open.
I think that's a slippery slope.
Okay.
I mean, I think you could say like the similar slippery slope in my argument, where you say if we don't give the death penalty to these people and we give them life without parole, what's next? We just give them a spanking? What's next? We don't punish them? I mean, I think it's just a flawed argument.
I mean, I can't speak. I know there's certain inmates in situations where they would have preferred the death penalty rather than serving another 40 years.
That's one of my other arguments, yeah.
But then again, in that case, you're just giving them what they want.
And like I said, I think some things can be cruel. I don't think the death penalty is necessarily cruel.
Okay, what about botched executions, though? Like in Oklahoma in 2014, where because other countries that we were getting the materials to make the lethal injections out of refused to give them to us, that a guy basically went into atrial fibrillation for roughly about 20, 30 minutes or so, uncontrollably shaking, couldn't breathe or anything like that too, and was in agonizing pain for 30, 40 minutes or so after that too.
I think mistakes can be made in anything. Like you could argue life without parole is cruel and unusual punishment because of torture that inmates do on each other. There's always complications that happen. It really matters what the majority is and what the minority is.
But that's a complication that could be solved pretty simply.
Could be. It's much easier to just to order the right chemicals than it is to control all the inmates.
That's the situation that we didn't have the ability to do that because we were getting it outsourced from other places and stuff that don't have the death penalty and don't have the similar view on it. I think it'd be very interesting if we took this aspect to somebody else in England, for example, where they haven't had the death penalty, I believe, since the early mid-1960s or something like that too, where they still do have violent crime, but it's I don't know, it's a very different like climate and opinion toward this because it's been gone for so long. There's just nobody that's really trying to bring it back.
Another difference with places like England and like you said, I think you mentioned Singapore and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
I mean, they're much more homogenous groups. There's less tension there. I mean, if you think of the racial tension in America, it's not necessarily. I mean, we don't have any.
I would argue England. I mean, there's been 7 terrorist attacks this past year in England, and there's a lot of racial tension right now.
Well, things are changing with the Syrian refugees, but I think traditionally on the books, I don't think me and you've looked up statistics for the last like 2 or 3 years, have
Exactly.
we? I think that might be subject to change, but a place like the States where you have large populations of like every group, I think it's a much different thing. I mean, I'm sure that if you throw that in with the Gini coefficient, you have a poor black neighborhood and a rich white neighborhood, as opposed to a poor white and a rich white. I'm sure it's a whole different world of racial resentment and just anger. If it was reversed, I'd be angry about it. So I'm sure that just throws a whole other monkey wrench in the system.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to look at it from the other side in that aspect. I do agree with that position, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, a lot of the statistics do look clear-cut in your favor, but I mean, I think if you analyze them a little bit deeper, a lot of it you can just, give over to other factors like poverty, the Gini coefficient, racial tension, anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the states are a whole other animal compared to most places.
Yeah, so would you look at it from more a federal perspective, or would you say federally in the states that states, if they want it, states can have it like they do now, exactly like they do now. Like Maryland doesn't have it, Texas has it. I don't know the exact portion. I want to say more states actually have it than don't, but I'm not 100% sure.
Hold on, I actually have that information.
But I think population-wise, I think states...
31 states have the death penalty, and 19 do not.
Yeah.
And 4 states have death penalty with gubernational moratorium.
Yeah, exactly. And then in those states, basically, they're still figuring out if they want it or not.
Colorado, Pennsylvania, Washington, Oregon. Figure your shit out now.
We're coming for you.
Yeah. I don't know. As far as who decides to do what, I can just tell you what the right decision is. I don't really want to force your hand. So I think you would all be smart to allow the death penalty, but if you don't want to, I'm not going to be angry about it. It's your problem.
I would argue the death penalty it's not an effective deterrent. It doesn't do what a lot of proponents of it say it does, even in regards to recidivism and other people committing crimes afterwards. There's another statistic that I had too, 88% of criminologists. Let me look at this exact one.
They're against the death penalty?
They're against it, but because they
earlier.
don't see it as a deterrent. And I think that was one of the aspects that I wanted to bring up, but just saying 88% of people who study this stuff a lot don't like it doesn't necessarily equate to it actually not being a deterrent. But I think that's a very notable subject.
Like you said, I don't think it's necessary. Like 9 out of 10 doctors at one point recommended smoking.
Yeah.
But I can see where they'd be confused. Like if you look at just the plain drawn out statistics of state by state death penalty and not death penalty, it doesn't. But I think those analyses just don't go deep enough. They don't control for other variables. They're just looking at the numbers, and there's huge correlations between the death penalty and the Gini coefficient and everything. I mean, there's just you have to draw it out. I think the example I brought up earlier, Massachusetts and New Hampshire, is much better. It kind of just clearly shows.
I think another interesting aspect of it, politicians like to support the death penalty to appear tough on crime a lot of the times too, but I don't know. It seems like almost those same kind of people that would be for it wouldn't be the same kind of people that would be in the execution room, like filling it out. Like they want other people kind of to do the dirty work or the stuff that they couldn't do themselves.
I don't know. Have you ever watched justice porn before?
No.
Justice Porn is basically, there's a subreddit for it. It's just a genre of like video where somebody does something fucked up and they get karma like almost instantly. I'd enjoyed watching that. That's got to be cathartic, I would think. Some people might not, but
yeah, I would tend to be see that stuff as kind of trivial and useless and not necessary. I think we this is good for us because we fall differently on the spectrum and how we I don't know, interact in the world and stuff like that too. So I think we kind of gravitated toward positions that feel more like us.
Yeah, politics is mostly personality.
Yeah.
What else was I going to argue?
That I'm the most beautiful man in the world.
Oh, you know it.
That could take a few podcasts.
Actually, that's about all my arguments.
That's pretty much the majority of what I wanted to, and I think we summarized pretty well there at the end. And then we have the links and stuff for the evidence in the bio, and we also have the survey to fill out to say who won or not. Also, like, comment, share, and subscribe. Go.